having the wherewithal, again, taking those extra steps, and I get it, it takes energy, but to, be deliberate about your choices, especially if it means instilling more joy, within a family atmosphere. Generally biasing yourself towards fun is the right call.
Welcome to the Relational Parenting Podcast. I'm Jennifer Hayes, a parent coach with over 20 years of hands-on experience raising kids. Each week, I sit down with parents just like you and other parenting experts and discuss the complicated issues that parents face today, as well as some of the oldest questions in the book. With the latest research and the framework of my relational parenting method, we offer thought-provoking solutions to your deepest parenting struggles. Relational parenting is devoted to breaking generational trauma patterns and healing past wounding so you can be the strong, confident parent your kids need. Send me all your parenting questions and stories to get them answered on the podcast. Let's get started. Dr. Mike Rucker is an organizational psychologist, behavioral scientist, and charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. He's been academically published in publications like the International Journal of Workplace Health Management. His ideas about fun and health have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Fast Company, Psychology Today, Forbes, Vox, Thrive Global, Mindful, mindbodygreen, and more. He currently serves as a senior leader at Active Wellness and is the author of 2023's top-rated happiness book, The Fun Habit, which is out now. Welcome back, everybody, to the Relational Parenting Podcast. We have our guest this week, Mike Rucker, and he is an organizational psychologist and behavior scientist, along with a whole bunch of other roles that you play in your life, including parent. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Welcome.
Daughter and a son. We're going into spring break, so it's an exciting week.
How old are they?
My daughter's 12 and my son's about 9. He's 8 right now, but going on 9.
In the thick of it. Yeah.
It's
fun,
welcome.
I'm so excited to have you here. I'm so excited to talk about this book that you wrote. And I think there's going to be so many little golden nuggets. I just know it, that relate from your book to just life in general, but also into parenting.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah. Well, so tell me how you came to write The Fun Habit.
So the backstory is I've been looking at positive psychology for some time. I was lucky enough to be invited to be an early member of kind of the cohort of academics and practitioners in the space. For folks that don't know what positive psychology is, essentially it's a facet of psychology that was created about the beginning of the millennium to use psychology as a tool for betterment. So up until that point, clinical psychology had primarily been, a tool for therapists or folks that were trying to treat some sort of deficit or improve, mental hygiene. And things like gratitude and mindfulness were always on the margins. And so we began to talk about those things as a cohort. But the focus was really on happiness at the beginning because it was important at that time because we weren't talking about happiness to do it. But what happened over time was we began to kind of overemphasize this idea of happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we have a word for it, right? It's better understood, and we talk about toxic positivity. But back then, we didn't have the World Happiness Report and, things of that nature. And some of these tools were getting picked up by quote unquote life coaches and essentially overprescribed. And we were teaching people, right? Like that happiness should be this outcome, this thing that you strive for. And paradoxically, what we found, over time was that directive, like kind of pushing people in that direction, paradoxically, were making some of the most unhappy people, and myself included. So essentially the problem is, right, when you make happiness this thing that you're trying to achieve, it becomes something out in the distance. And we didn't understand this, right? Because, okay, great. That's kind of this carrot that makes you, change some things you do, look for life hacks and things like that.
Yeah.
But subconsciously, it makes you always see happiness out in the distance, and you
Yep.
start to ruminate on the gap between where your feet are and where you believe happiness is, and forget that it's really where your feet are. And
Yes.
now what we know is that that rumination starts to bleed into your identity. So folks that were really overly concerned with, how happy they are, how they compare against their neighbors. So sometimes it happens insidiously, like, in at the subconscious level, they'll just keep looking at that gap and go, I must be an unhappy person because happiness is always
Mm-hmm.
over there. And once it gets that bad, then there's this weird thing about our identity, right? Where we start to look for artifacts. Like most people are familiar with confirmation bias now. You start
Yeah.
to like, oh, well, the world's just not that great of a place, right? And just very strange pathological things begin to happen. And so that was kind of the beginning of the book. The impetus for me was, unfortunately, quite suddenly in 2016, I lost my younger brother to a pulmonary embolism. And around the same time, I had been a lifelong runner and found out I had an undiagnosed injury, a labrum tear in my hip. And so was going to need to get that remediated and wouldn't be able to run again. And
Oh, wow.
so talk about identity, right? He
Yeah.
was my only sibling. And so, I was essentially an only child. And then this thing that was the crux of my identity had been taken away from me. But yet I was Pollyanna because here I am from the positive psych tribe, right? So I'll will myself through gratitude and meditation out of this
Right.
malaise. And the more I tried to do that, to just be like, I'll get through this, without asking for help, without processing the trauma, I was getting close to a clinical diagnosis. And so I guess, being kind of a geek about research and whatnot, I was self-aware that this was happening, but I wanted to dissect why. And that's kind of the beginning of this path on looking at fun juxtaposed to happiness.
Yeah. 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 Talk about it. Talk about an identity crisis. That's absolutely when you lose somebody that close. And then you also lose the ability to participate in an activity that up until that point in your life absolutely kind of defined something for you, part of you, and probably part of your fun, right, in
Oh,
life.
absolutely.
Something that brought you joy, and then you all of a sudden lose that as well at the same time. That's
Not only addition like joy, right, but also, admittedly, I have low level anxiety. I mean, I've always been kind of a hustler,
mm-hmm.
and I like that. Like I believe, a healthy level of anxiety that needs to be managed, right? But I can use
Yeah.
that as fuel. And running was really a great non-pharmaceutical way, to keep that at bay. If I was really stressed,
Mm-hmm.
throw on some running shoes, get out there, put on some music I like, and come back a different person. And
Yeah.
so not only was, to your point, my fun taken away, but I think importantly, acknowledging the way, I mitigated this challenge was taken away too. So it was really an avalanche. It kind of sucked.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned positive psychology that has now we can sometimes reference some of those tools when used incorrectly or overused as toxic positivity, and that's definitely something that we've talked about here on the podcast and that I talk about in parenting as well, is that we can't just paint over everything in life and throw some inspirational quote on top of it, or you'll get through it, or just keep going, things like that. It glosses over the actual experience of the person, and when you gloss over it, you don't actually feel what you need to feel in order to move through it. You skip over it, and it just lays latent in your body and in your mind, and it ends up coming out in other very unhealthy ways. So I'm curious how did your positive psychology training help you through some of that era of your life in 2016, or did you have to pivot and kind of look at another way of processing things?
So I want to take a step back and then I'll definitely answer your question because I agree with everything you said. But I think an important second component, especially for us that are trying to help others, yourself
Mm-hmm.
included, is that dissonance too, right? Like when you are well-meaning, but you give that, essentially what's meant to be a gift to someone that's not ready to receive it. They might still want to accept it, but like that disconnect, right? Like, you'll get through it. Like, well, I don't feel like that right now. And so it can cause what, it's kind of a geeky word, but moral injury, right? And it's the person doing it doesn't mean it's not an ill intent. I mean, most people are coming from this great place, but I think it's important to, yes, you don't paint over it because we need time to process. And certainly that was a hard learned lesson for me. But one that was gifted to me recently too is, this idea that, especially if we are going to try and help others, to the extent that we can apply our empathy and be like, is this person ready for this particular tool or message, right? And so that is a good segue into answering your question. I think they were always there to be helpful because all these tools are helpful, right? I mean, the restorative nature of gratitude, that is well established, right?
Yes.
But one of the things that is known well now, this research comes from Sonia Luber-Mirsky out of the University of California at Riverside, was this weird thing similar to 8 glasses of water that if anyone's read Freakonomics, like there's no science behind that. You hear that all the time, right? You're supposed to drink 8 glasses of water.
Yeah.
This idea that you're supposed to be grateful for 3 things a day, it isn't grounded in anything that really came out of, empirical research. So she went and looked at that as a directive because you were seeing that all over Instagram, right? All the like, here, do this, keep your gratitude journal and make sure you find 3 things a day. And again, if you're not in a place where that's an appropriate directive, like that can start to, you start to get frustrated, right? Like, well, finding 3 things a day to be grateful for, that should be easy and I can't do it. Maybe you shouldn't. Your brother just passed away. Like that, you're in an emotional state where, finding, positively emotional things to sort of relish in isn't what your body needs right now. And so, should you find episodic things to be grateful for, like for a friend that helps you with bereavement? Absolutely, right? Because that's going to make you feel connected again. You're going to realize like, yes, I'm, amongst this, era of great loss, but I also realize there's still people in my life that can bring me joy. But to do that 3 times a day is going to actually cause me harm. And so those tools are always there to be helpful. But I think where we want to skew was, these sort of absolute immutable, like, no, it's 3 times a day, right? Or like this isn't exactly in line with your question, but I talk about it in the book, like these apps where we know meditation is a great tool too, right? But like, especially if you're not neurotypical, the idea of trying to get someone to meditate like 20 or 30 minutes a day, right? So I have a Muse device and I only really want to meditate 5 to 10 minutes a day, but it keeps sending me notifications like, you did great today. Let's try for 20 tomorrow. Like, why? And it actually I turned them off because that started to make me hate meditation before I even realized like, oh, wait, this is just, again, maladaptive advice. Some engineer that doesn't even really understand behavioral science was just, trying to do what you would do in an app because notifications pull us back to our phones, right? And that makes these things addictive. And so, again, it was probably with really well-meaning intent. Like, of course, we should get people to meditate more, but more a lot of times isn't better. And so, again, to kind of tie it all into a bow, like the tools have always been helpful, right? But at that time, being overprescribed to them or to think that they were going to fill in this huge fissure that was left in my brother's absence just wasn't it. That what was going to heal that fissure was time and processing what it meant, to now have an intimate relationship with mortality because he was, my younger brother, right? So I think there's kind of a gift in believing you're going to live forever, which a lot of us do until we're like smacked in the face with mortality. But then there's an even bigger gift of understanding that we only have a certain amount of time here, once you're able to get there. And so anyways, now I'm playing outside the lines a little bit, but so they were helpful. But again, what we now know is that in the right context, they're helpful. And so we need to be really careful about that. And if one doesn't work, throw it out. A lot of folks are like, no, just keep trying. It will work. Like, no.
Different tools for different people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also different timelines. Your brother's passing, taking your brother's passing and comparing it to my father's passing. And based on, there's so many different factors that play into who you are versus who I am and how we process things differently, just in the way that our brains work, the way that our emotions work, where we're at in our lives. The support system we either do or don't have, the responsibilities we do or don't have, like all of these factors play into processing something like that. And just like anything else in life, that's true for everybody. And so each tool isn't necessarily meant to be used by every single person.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you bring up a good point. I mean, all of those journeys are so complex, each with their own sort of attributes that, warrant kind of a tailored approach. And so I think that's the important message, right? Is that, whether it's trying to architect something in a more joyful way or navigate, really deep waters, like take that advice, pull the meat from the bone, but if it's not working, don't let that cause further injury. Say, this isn't working for me. And hopefully you're in a supportive environment where people understand boundaries. And if you're not, that can get even more complicated, but at least give yourself some grace. Because I think a lot of folks forget to do that, right? Especially in those times of trauma, we forget that we have agency and autonomy because it's hard that this thing happened to us, right? So it's hard to remember that we still have some control over how we navigate it. And that's really what was able to help me pull myself out of that despite my emotional state, in certain circumstances, based on my preferences, I could still elicit enjoyable experiences with the folks that I cared about while sort of putting on horse blinders for some of the things that were more problematic.
Yeah. I think that applies in parenting too, because you reiterated and you said this before that to say the quote, "This tool isn't working for me." And so often when something is prescribed to us as this should help you, this will make things better, and it doesn't, then we think there's something wrong with us. And that also applies to our children and the way that we help our children navigate through the world, whether it's through a loss and grief, or whether it's through a fight with a friend at school, or whether it's through falling down and scraping their knee for the first time, however small or big that it might be, the way that we help our children navigate through hardship is going to be different for each child, because each child is unique and has their own way of processing and brain function and emotional process and all of that. And so I just love that you said that, because I immediately was just like, yeah. And kids, like, we think that kids, like, where does that come through as an adult, where I think something's wrong with me if the tool isn't working? Well, it comes from my childhood, where I was told over and over again that these things should work for me, or like, you should be getting A's in school, or you should be doing well at this sport, or you should be, the expectation is there for me to perform the same way that other people are performing, versus these are Jenny's strengths. And so we should be putting her in an environment, in a place where she can succeed at the things that she is good at, and everything else just doesn't matter. And that applies with hardship, getting our kids through hardship. They're unique beings, and finding the right tool for our kids individually is so important.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of folks like you through the process, because admittedly, I'm not a parent expert, but because I have looked at the research with regards to enjoyment in parenting, I get invited on, amazing podcasts like yours. And I've learned from folks like you about those differences through, my academic training, we get a deep understanding of nurture versus nature. So I kind of understood that lens, but being given the gift of making sure that I look at both my kids differently, which was only sort of passed down to me, a couple of years ago, has been such a game changer, because it's wild. My daughter processes information a lot like me. So maybe that was like, almost a blessing and a curse, because we're so aligned that there's little disconnect, right? Like when I hear her describe something, I can essentially use my lens, because I know 80% of it's how I see the world. My son sees the world so differently than me and my daughter, but I didn't acknowledge that because I was naive, up until recently. And now that I know the way that he processes information and sort of then, how it affects him externally is so different. It's just been amazing, because like now we're on the same page, right? It's Stephen Covey at its best, right? And so, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think the more that we can acknowledge that, and whether you want to call it empathy or not, I think just always leads to better outcomes across all domains of life.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We need to put that tough, on a sign.
Because the beginning of any sort of introspection is through our own lens. So it really does require such a intention, because you have to slow down, right? It's at least 2 or 3 extra steps. You have to take in their information, then you have to kind of guess, where they're coming from, and completely put yours aside, which also takes energy. And then you kind of need to put it together. So it's, it's mindfulness at its best, but it can be exhausting, quite frankly.
I always say like that, mindful parenting, relational parenting, it's not the easier version of parenting. It's easier to just look at things through your own lens and your own opinion and, lay down the law. That's easier. It's so much easier. Yeah. But you're going to get kids who wander out into the world without knowing what the hell to do with themselves.
You tell me, but my understanding too is in the modern era, before, without all of the available distraction, I think it was easier for our generation, our parents' generation, to be able to operate that way, right? But now kids have a faster breaking point. And so one of the things that we're seeing, right, is that parents that do that, they might get lucky and it might work. But when it doesn't work, the kids are just like, okay, this form of being punitive or, just I don't care anymore. And so you have the potential, at 15 or 16 for them to just not listen to you anymore, much faster than it was for our generation.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that, but I think that you're right. Because especially teenagers, they have access to so much more information. When I was growing up, we had just I was 16 and got a flip phone. So the majority smartphones didn't come out till,
because now that's showing my age. I had a pager, so we're a couple of years back.
So I didn't have access, I didn't have constant access to the internet. I wasn't on screens all the time. I grew up outside, and so outside of your close community, your friends, your family, your school, you didn't really know much more about the world than that. And so our worlds were a lot smaller back then. And I think that the access to the internet and the access to information, there's a lot of negatives. There's a lot of things I have to say about screen time, but that's for a different episode. But I think that one of the positives is that kids have more access to that there might be a different way to live your life. You don't have to act like this, or you don't have to be bullied or constantly yelled at or put down and shamed and all of these things all the time. And so I think that when you have a little bit broader of a world view, which back in the day you had to like travel and go out into the world to learn, and now you can be on the internet for a few hours and be like, oh, other people live different ways. And I think that has empowered some kids to be like, this is abusive and I don't respect you, and I'm not going to listen to you anymore. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, that's exactly how I'd explain it as well. And it seems to be holding true, because you just, see it amongst kind of that dysfunction. And I don't know if it's wisdom, if it's faster maturity, like a lot of these kind of bigger concepts. There's a level of complexity, right? We know, all the way from biochemistry and hormones and foods that people are maturing faster, right? So, folks aren't able to be kids at both a psychological and physiological level like we were, right? So I don't think it's anyone's fault either, but it is the paradigm in which we're living. And so but the one thing that I wholeheartedly believe, and it's based on the empirical evidence I've seen, is that you can only be punitive up to a certain point now. Where my parents were punitive up until I left for college, and then, right, like you're 18, now you get your agency and autonomy. It's almost like your ticket got punched, and it was part of the recipe, right? But now, at 15 or 16, if it's a heavy hand, ultimately it's going to fail at some point, which is surprising a lot of parents, apparently.
Oh, really?
Because they've now lost control, but they were used to wait. But my parents, I had to say what they, I had to do what they said. And that's just, for a lot of folks, not that. And when their kids challenge them at such a young age, right, it's surprising, because it is kind of a new normal. And I don't know what's right or wrong. I just know it's something that we're all facing, so we do need to at least talk about it.
Yeah. When I think punitive parenting, like, of course, all any of us knows about parenting, unless you've studied it, unless you've gone into that field and studied child development and psychology and all of these things. The only thing that we know going into parenting is how we were parented. So of course that cycle repeats itself, and being punitive comes through as a way to parent. And you seek to have children who listen to you and obey, and best, you've been on earth longer, and in a lot of ways, in judgment and safety, that's true. You do know better. However, if you're raising adults, is something I like to say. You're not raising children, you're raising adults. And so if you treat them like insignificant, disrespectful, punitive, and you don't value their input or give them a voice or do any of these things that we now know based on empirical research that you need to do in order to raise like a really mentally and emotionally well adult, then it shouldn't shock you that that's what you're going to get back when they start getting bigger and you can't just control them physically anymore. When they're toddlers, when they're 9-year-olds, you can still kind of pick them up and throw them over your shoulder, and you're still bigger and they're still scared of you. But once that fear goes away, like if that's all you've been using in your parenting, then your tools are gone by the time they're 15 and 16 years old, And
another thing that I found fascinating, like in your training, did you have to watch the Bobo the Clown videos about modeling adult behavior? It's amazing. Anyone can Google it. It's from the 60s. My gosh. But so this adult comes in and starts being mean to what's essentially one of those blow up punch clowns, and gets physical with it. And immediately children that don't even really have a connection to the adult start treating this clown horribly, right? Yeah. And so that's kind of the beginning, but we understand how much now kids do model our behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And so it used to be our parents would tell us what to do, and it was instructional, right? And now it's so much more important to show. for all the reasons that you have already indicated. And that is because they have a worldview that we just didn't have access to. And whether that's right or wrong, because I kind of do like the fact that I was a kid for a long time, maybe more immature longer than I should have been. But I mean, my 12-year-old daughter, I like the way you framed it. I mean, we are raising a young adult now. She is not a 12-year-old in the sense of what I remember when I was 12, when I was still looking for crawdads in our local creek. You know, I mean, when I look at her Google history, there's good and bad in there, of course, but the intellect just blows me away. The questions that she's asking in the search bar aren't things that I thought about until I was in college.
Yeah. Kids they are growing up faster. And I don't, personally for me, limits on internet accessibility and all of that is the plan. But I also think that the internet can be a friend in that, they can Google things and ask questions. And, if you have that bond and that relationship, they can bring those questions to you, the parent. And it does foster another level of connection and conversation between you and your child and getting to know each other even better and all of those things. But I think, I remember when I was 12, I was just a kid. I was just doing kid stuff. And now I know a 12-year-old who, I take her out for her birthday every year. She gets a whole day of whatever she wants to do. And it used to be like, let's go swimming and go to the park. And now all of a sudden this year it's let's go to Sephora and whatnot. And I'm like, oh my God, stop it.
Yeah, that's what my daughter wanted for her 12th birthday. She wanted a day at the mall with her friends.
Yeah.
And and they had hundreds of dollars, all of them. And it's not like we're super affluent, and that's just something that I don't remember. I think got $5 to go to the arcade. Yeah. And I know that sounds like in my day, milk was 25 cents, but it still seems ridiculous. We definitely weren't going to the mall, not until, we were late teenagers.
Yeah.
But I think to circle back about building that rapport, because it is so important, I think, based on the cautionary tale that we've just talked about, going back to concepts of fun that could be helpful, I think that is, because we're sort of meeting closer in the middle than any previous era, being able to be childlike with your kid so that they don't necessarily look at you as an adult in moments. Obviously there's going to be plenty of times where you have to be an adult or, you're in a role where you need to be a mentor because they're doing something wrong or whatever. But if you can get down to their level, the research that I've found, especially using, fun as the fuel, you will get a rapport like they are your friend. They'll almost forget that, that you're their parent, right? And they'll disclose stuff and you'll get to know stuff about them that as a parent, you never would. And so that's what, one of the things I really do like about, creating these playful, fun experiences with your kids is when you see that, when they those moments where they forget, right, that you're their parent, and they're my daughter will catch herself. She'll start telling me about the boy she likes, and then, she'll, oh, wait a second, this is my dad. And so our new jam right now is playing pickleball together, and I'll just let it naturally flow, you see, lets down her guard, starts, looking at me as a friend, and as she should, right? And then we have this amazing experience, and then I'm her dad again. But those moments can be not just restorative and exciting, and we could get in the whole neuroscience if you want, because you remember those moments, right? Instead of the habitual stuff we do as parents, right? Okay, I just need to take my kid to practice, or, if they're younger, I'll just get them to the park, and you're sitting there mindlessly scrolling Instagram just because you're trying to essentially babysit or childcare, not really create these moments. But when you do create those moments, then you encode amazing information, right? You have all these things to look back on and relish. And sometimes that's as simple as just making that active choice of, I'm not going to be passive here. I'm going to figure out how to co-create an experience where we both want to be there, at the same level.
And when it's like what you're talking about is connection. It could boil down to that word, and you're always her dad, right? She, in any moment, no matter what you're creating with her, you're always her dad. But there are moments where, like you said, we can create fun, which creates ease in our bodies and in our minds, and it creates safety. And so when she feels your guard come down, her guard comes down. And then all of a sudden, all of these things that she wants to talk to a trusted person about can come out. And they've shown in research, even with like 2 and 3 year olds, you can get little kids to talk to you, and usually only when you're in play with them.
Yeah.
I can be in the car with a 3-year-old and ask him how his preschool day was, and he'll just be like, good, and look out the window. But if we get home and we're playing with his Magnetiles, he'll just all of a sudden, unprompted, start telling me about this thing he did with his friend at school, or, the coolest part of his day, or something about his teacher, and it's an intentional release of like the guard we have up as adults, as we're like, all right, I got to do this, and I've got to get this done, and this has to happen, and stress and anxiety and all the things that we have to be responsible for as adults. When we can have those moments, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, a half hour pickleball game, whatever it is, and we can let our guard down, that's when our kids are going to feel safe, and they're going to open up too.
Yeah. And the physical science behind it's getting really interesting too, right? As we're learning more about the limbic system, just being able to downregulate all of that by, calming down all of the worries that adults have now, which, because of this, knowledge era that we live in, is more intense than it ever was, right? So we kind of talked about some of the complexities with kids. I mean, we should give ourselves some grace too, right? Because it's pretty complex for us too. I mean, you're, part of the sandwich generation, right? This is an era that never really saw having to take care of kids and aging parents. And so, that weight of responsibility is another, aspect of life that's fairly new that we don't talk about a lot, right? But I mean, the stresses that we're taking on are just wholeheartedly more intense than they ever have been before. And yet we're like, what's wrong with us? Well, there's a lot of headwinds coming at us,
Yeah, absolutely. So in your book, The Fun Habit, it's one of the snippets that I read about it that I just absolutely loved. I want to read it to you. It says, the fun habit is anti-toxic positivity and happiness striving. The approach is very much about embracing all of your feelings and mindfully adding more fun to your life rather than chasing after happiness. He, as in you, shows you how to find the time and how to find the kind of fun that's right for you. And so I'm curious, what are some of those tangible ways that that you can find the time and find the right kind of fun and engage in those things?
Yeah. So in the book, I essentially, we talked about it a little bit, but fun is so unique to the individual, right? That's another, in the spirit of not prescribing anything to anyone, right? Like, I unpack how, there's a couple of things. So let me start that, one of the things I discuss in the book is, especially here in the Western world, I'll work with people that are like, I'm just not fun. And then when I unpack that, it's because they bought into the marketing version of what fun is, right? These high arousal activities, up against, the guardrail at a rock concert, or, being at a beach with a bunch of other influencers. And so this work comes from Jeannie Tsai out of Stanford. But I mean, when we're talking about fun, it's just, are you finding pleasure in the things that you're doing, and are you drawn to them, right? So, an introvert that where fun for them is around a pool, engaging in a good book, and they get lost in it for hours, they're just as fun as the person crowd surfing, at a Rage Against the Machine concert. And yet they'll be like, well, I'm not a fun person, which is such a shame, right? Because again, that bleeds into your identity. So reframing that is important. But with regards to just tactical advice, I think, again, it's sort of rooted in self-determination theory, but where can you find pockets in your 168 hours where you can reclaim time for yourself? Whether that's co-creating experiences and situations where, initially you felt like you had to do it, like I have to take my kids to the park. And then just retooling that to like, I get to play pickleball with my daughter, right? Or, changing the circumstance to something that feels like it's, a mundane task into something that you actually like to do. A lot of adults end up getting stuck because they haven't thought about fun for so long. They don't have any fresh ideas. And that's a really easy fix, luckily. That's just sitting down with yourself for an hour and going, you know what, if I had the time, what could I do that I would find fun, right? And so a little bit of self exploration generally gives you a lot of good answers. And then if you look at that list and pare it down to like 8 or 15 things, there are generally a few of them that you could do. You just hadn't thought about it, right? Like even just coffee with an old friend that you haven't talked to for a couple of months. And the nice thing is that once you integrate that back in, and it's generally, we're just talking about 1 to 3 hours of the 168 that you have in a week. You're able to go, wait a second, okay, that was only 1 hour, but now today, the next day feels so much better. And I'm actually able to get more done, which then frees up more time. And then you find that balance, right? Just like sleep, because again, life isn't meant to be fun all the time, right? That would be, again, back to toxic positivity. And just like you wouldn't tell someone to sleep for 14 hours, but if you're not sleeping at all, we need to sort that out, right? And so in a similar fashion, if you're like, you know what, I just don't have fun, like we need to fix that. And so kind of the entryway into that is to start small, because again, like a lot of behavior change, right? Oftentimes a great analogy is getting back into the weight room, January 2nd, and you're like, I'm going to go 6 days a week, every week. And then that just wasn't sustainable. The same goes with fun. Like anyone that's like, I'm going to change out, like I'm going to go hike the Himalayas or, go on some crazy vacation. And then that vacation's over and they're like, why am I still unhappy? Well, that wasn't the point, right? That's why it's called the fun habit. How can we habitually create these micro moments of joy? And generally that's much, much easier than people think. And again, it starts by being mindful, making sure you're not looking at this as a prescription that has to be sort of added on to your already busy life. It's about finding those things that you're doing that you really don't enjoy that can be replaced with things that are, more enjoyable, even if that just means changing the way you're going about things.
Well, at the beginning, you mentioned the chasing after happiness, right? This carrot that dangles out in front of us, but we never actually reach it, and then we could just go through our lives feeling miserable. How is the fun habit different from that?
So it's essentially an invitation to have joy in the present, right? Again, so many of us, kind of relinquish it to that once a year vacation at the end, especially here in North America, where, we're the second to last in the developed nation for giving folks access to leisure, right? 2 years off for 1 year's worth of work. Yeah. It's only one country worse than us, Micronesia, which is weird when you think about how developed this country is, right? And we're now learning that lack of leisure and the inaccessibility to, joyful moments is leading to a whole host of real problems, which are actually paradoxically affecting productivity. So luckily, we're finally starting to awaken that this needs to change. I do like to liken it to how we had this renaissance of sleep in the 90s. If you recall, like in the 90s, hustlers were celebrating sleep deprivation. And now you would never do that, right? Even, the most staunch sort of A-type people realize that if they're not maintaining good sleep hygiene, they can't be productive. And we're learning the same about leisure and enjoying yourself. If you're not spinning down and down-regulating these systems, you're eventually going to burn out. Academically, the group of folks that I study the most are physicians. Last year was the worst year for them at 63% reporting they're burnt out. And you're seeing, in that vocation, people just leaving the profession, which is going to create a real problem for a different episode. But But you're seeing that across the board, right? And you're seeing it with parenting as well. And the problem is once you get to that state, once you're not enjoying yourself, then you start to lose empathy. And for parents, that can be especially problematic, right? Because again, when everything seems like work, like you feel like it's just your duty to get this done and you're not finding any joy in the things that you're doing, eventually you're going to get to a place where you have some disdain for, week after week of like, okay, well, this is Groundhog's Day. And just what a horrible place to kind of exist in, right? And we do know it can lead, to things outside of just malaise. It can lead to clinical issues. And so, but the good news again is similar to sleep, where it's just like, no, you just do a few things. You make sure your room's a little bit colder. Make sure you're not looking at a screen an hour before bed. Fun is the same thing. Like, no, let's just make a few better choices instead of displacing the discomfort of the day. Let's be active about how you engage in activities that you want to do. You're allowed to have a voice. You're allowed to co-create these experiences with the people that coexist in your space. You have a voice, and just those subtle shifts, right, are enough to kind of get you out of this downward spiral and get you back to an upward spiral, to the point that you find that balance.
I love that. And I love what you mentioned with parenting, because we see, parents burn out for so many reasons. And everyone has so much going on and juggling work and finances and your own health and your children's health and nutrition and, a million different things. And there's something throughout my childcare experience that I've learned, especially when I was a nanny full time, is that no matter how much I loved or enjoyed caring for children, I would burn out. And I finally realized that I was just doing the activities with these kids that were like the typical societal expectation. And so, but then when I started thinking kind of like for myself, being like, what would I want to do today? And how can I adapt it so that the child can participate in it? I was like, oh, like we can just go have fun and they can just come along. It doesn't have to be, if you have, I always think of young children because they're, older kids, it's a little bit easier to take them places or drop them off at a friend's house and have your own time. But when you've got really little kids, it can be a lot harder to kind of get out of the house and go do things. But it is possible. And the more that you do real things with your kids, things that they would actually do for themselves when they get older, the more just normal their life is going to be, because you instead of trying to create all of these like kid-friendly activities at home, and I'm going to put together a craft basket and do all this like back work.
And that's the key word, right? I was waiting for it, but work. What a shame,
yeah.
right?
It's like I've got to put together and plan, like make lesson plans almost for my kids, just so that they have something to do while I do the dishes. It's like, going to the park could be I'm getting my steps in for the day and they're coming and I'm watching them play while I'm walking around the park, or doing my run while they're playing at the park, or, and you just kind of have to run with acceptance of your run might get a little interrupted if your kid falls down and needs a hug.
And be okay with that, right? Like the three things I would say there is, one you just touched on, is that are kind of light bulb moments, right? Is that flexibility. Like to the extent that you can relinquish any sort of rigid expectations, like you're going to be so much better off. It might take a little bit longer, might not be completely in line with your ideology, but if no one needs to be taken to the hospital, everything's going to be okay.
Right.
The second is the power you have to co-create these experiences with your kids. So many people approach it through the lens of performative art. Like, no, you don't have to create this experience just like you would with any other friend. And quite frankly, how they would with their friends. Hey, what do you want to do today? Oh, guess what? I don't like that. So do you have like 3 other options? And the kid will, right? You might
Yeah.
not because you've forgotten, but the kid will give you 3 and you'll go, this is one I can do. Yeah, let's play with Play-Doh, or, you hate Legos and they bring up Legos. Legos, what else do you got? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, want to go bike riding? Yeah, I do, and actually I wanted to exercise today. So that's perfect, right?
Yeah.
And then quite frankly, I think I forgot the third one.
It's okay. It might come back to you. Yeah, the co-creation. I love that because I also, right before we started recording, you mentioned child-centric parenting, and I think that there was like punitive authoritarian parenting back in our day, and we grew up and realized that wasn't right. And then I think things swung the other way for a while, with being like, you have to give yourself up in order to raise your children correctly. You have to give them everything. You have to, self-sacrifice and all of these things. But then you have kids growing up who have no sense of discipline, responsibility, social acceptance, etc. And they're just running rampant. And I think that the last maybe 5-10 years, we're starting to hopefully swing back towards the middle here, where you can be a parent and still be yourself and still raise really healthy children. And in fact, that is the way to raise them, is by you still have a voice as a parent, and you still have options, and you get to co-create a life with your children, not have your life completely dominated by your children and their needs.
Yeah, I agree. What a weird directive that a lot of our parents were guided by, right?
Yeah.
Spare the rod, spoil the child. Right. It's weird. But to your point too, completely relinquishing control is inappropriate and can lead to what we're seeing. And so I think this, realization that, okay, maturity is happening faster, and they're no longer going to be an extension of our namesake. We're not, cobblers aren't creating cobblers. They have, access to information, and they truly are their own person much earlier than, we were or our parents were. Means there needs to be a new rule book, but it doesn't mean that we're still not parents and that we still don't have an immense amount of impact of whether or not they're successful or not. And so I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. But I still think we're figuring it out, because the way things are evolving is so quick, right? I mean, the threats are new, especially with online bullying and, the kind of intrinsic and intrinsic ways that personality is now developed, because there's so many artificial currencies with regards to how you get validated, right? We didn't have likes and comments, and our audience was our peers at high school, not a global, set of what in the book I call an army of nothing. But at 13 years old, it's really hard to understand that these folks don't care about your well-being, right? I mean, it holds a lot more weight, and so it's a complex landscape for sure.
It is, and it's definitely, there's this generation of parents right now are navigating technology that has never existed before. So there is no rule book. There is there's no rules and playbook. There is a lot I would encourage parents. There's about 8 years of solid research now on the effects of social media on our children's brains and development and things like that. And I would encourage anyone listening to go look up those empirical studies, because it's very soundly proven that social media has profoundly negative effects on younger minds.
Untethered. I would make that
Untethered,
qualification.
yes. Yes. Not that like social media should be banned level kind of things, but yeah, just having a 13-year-old with a cell phone, with a smartphone, and unregulated time to spend on the internet is, I was just looking at this number yesterday or the day before, but we went from teenage girls' suicide rates being like 12% to being 30% in less than 4 years.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, you're spot on. The two big things that I kind of dug into in the book is, one, the ability now to displace discomfort, right? So our kids have no resilience. If they're bored, they're frustrated, they don't like what we had to say, they can go into the room, instead of thinking about it, they can just forget about it, right? Because they have a device that pacifies them, essentially.
Yes.
And so when something really does go wrong, they have no tools to be able to navigate it because of these phones, which is horrible. And then the second is access to very strange ideas. And I know there are a lot of landmines there, especially if you start talking about, identity, sexual identity and things of that nature. It's not my subject matter, so I would just slowly walk away from it. But what I do think is true is that if someone is uncomfortable in their own skin, which quite frankly all kids are when they go through puberty, this access to someone telling them like this is why can be really problematic. That I will stand by.
Well, and exposure to topics that our children's brains are not capable of fully comprehending yet.
That's a good way to put it as well.
Is something that I've looked into, and it's scary that there are types of information out there that they're not developmentally capable of processing appropriately and making decisions.
And the 1-2 punch is, if they're mildly interested in it, they're going to believe it's important because they don't also understand how these algorithms work, right?
Right.
Like YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok's like, oh, this individual, because they've already lied about their age, right? Because they're not supposed to be on there as preteens, wants more information on X. And so the child is going to be like, oh, this is clearly truth because this is all I'm getting, because they don't understand that it's kind of been rigged against them. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think parents don't know. And I think that it's easy to forget that our prefrontal cortex, like our judgment center, isn't fully developed till we're like 25 to 28 years old. And so having 12 and 13-year-olds make decisions based on something they saw on the internet a couple of times is just absolutely insane to me.
Yeah. And I mean, this is throwing a huge rock at a big glass house, but, it goes back to what you were saying, where sometimes, to the extent that you have the capacity to endure, you got to remember parenting's work, because a lot of times, I'll let it go because I have something to do and it's an easy babysitter. And I've really been trying to get better at that. Like, you know what? I've got 18 years with you. Yes, I'd like to go mow the lawn right now, but the grass can stay uncut for 3 more days. I'm not going to let you just go off, and essentially waste time because I want to spend this time with you. And I mean, what a great win-win, right? Gets them away from the phone. And then 2, I get to engage with them. And, it's one of those things at a broader context. We always think there's going to be some consequence, and you can use that 2-day, 2 months, 2-year rule, right? In 2 days, am I going to be pissed the lawn's not mowed? Yeah, probably. In 2 years, will I care? Absolutely not. But in 2 years, I'd be glad, I spent another hour with my daughter, who's now off in, college or whatever it is. Obviously, I'm kind of mixing metaphors here, but, I think having the wherewithal, again, taking those extra steps, and I get it, it takes energy, but to, be deliberate about your choices, especially if it means instilling more joy, within a family atmosphere. Generally biasing yourself towards fun is the right call.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think.
And I would say social media use is not fun. It's not.
Right.
I geek out about it in the book, but the psychological concept is called valence, right? And so valence is just a fancy word for saying pleasure. And so fun, right, is on the positive side of valence. Are you enjoying what you're doing, and are you drawn to it? But what social media tricks us into thinking is that we are. But when you look at it, right, whether it's brain scans or whatever, all it's doing is displacing that boredom or frustration.
Yep.
Especially if it's not, connecting with others. Like if
Yeah.
you have family on the other side of the US and you're like looking at, wedding photos that you weren't able to attend, that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about mindlessly just,
scrolling.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And you mentioned that earlier, and it's a Band-Aid. It becomes a way for not just kids, but adults. And I mean, I'm guilty of it too, of I want to space out, or I don't want to have to think about this thing that's bothering me. And so I'm just going to mindlessly scroll and see if someone else will just cheer me up or distract me for a second. And I know I'm doing it, and I still do it. Imagine a kid who doesn't have that awareness, and it feels good, and they maybe are getting likes and comments or whatever. Like, of course they're going to want to do that all of the time. But yeah, it's not true joy.
Yeah.
With a few exceptions, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the family wedding photos.
Yeah. And even when it is working, it's devoid of oxytocin, right? And so when I've been trying to not use these academic words because I know it's silly and, and certainly doesn't connect with, but so there's this term we have, pro-social behavior, which is as geeky as it sounds, but really just, spending time with people you love. When we get that oxytocin and feel connected, our world becomes safer, and our introspection of everything happening to us becomes smaller. So by proxy, our problems become smaller. And the same is true for kids. So to the extent that we can lead by example, right? By even, again, if we're a little bit tired, if you're burnt out and you need help, then get it, right? But if we're just trying to course correct things that don't feel right, putting in that effort, even though it might seem like effort at the beginning, almost always pays dividends, right? It gets you out of that grind. And then ultimately it's infectious because you're like, wait a second. Yeah, there was that inertia I had to overcome, for the first 5 minutes, but I'm so glad I did this, especially if it's with people that you love.
Yes, I do. I experienced that. I want to go hang out with my friend or my friends or have people over, but then your mind just starts going, well, then we have to get food and we have to do this and we have to do that. I have to dress up and do my hair and do all the things. And that there's that initial effort, but it's just like anything else, like doing a workout, right? The benefits far outweigh the 5 minutes, the 5-minute initial uptake that it takes for you to put the clothes on and put the shoes on and go out and do it. You always feel better when you do it. And if and I imagine, applying that to the fun habit as well. It's going to take effort. You can't just sit and stare at a wall in your house and think that you're going to have fun. You got to think about it and get up and do it. But then you're going to feel better. If you have kids, they're going to feel better, and you're going to connect, and you're going to have that release of oxytocin, and you're going to build those relationships either with yourself or with the people you're having fun with, and your quality of life is going to skyrocket.
Yeah, and I would suggest if in the book I call it lures. If there's something that really is causing friction, let's say you don't want to cook, figure out how not to. And for exercising, that's especially important. If there's a piece of it that you don't like, one of the things another kind of really fun light bulb moment that, again, when you say it out loud is so simple, but I don't know how many people, we all know that we need to engage in aerobic activity, right? But so many people, again, because of social normative behavior, feel like it has to happen in a gym. And they'll be like, you know what? I've tried to get healthy, but I just don't like the health club. Well, have you tried hiking in nature as like,
right.
And they're like, wait, I can do that? Like, you always could have done that. But I'm glad to invite you to do it, and like now they're off to the races. Like, oh my gosh, because, then you have the added benefit of nature. That's a whole another podcast as well. But yeah, if you hate the gym, then just ask better questions,
Yeah.
Or if you hate cooking, you're like, oh, I'd love to get together with my friends, but it means this whole thing. Like, then get rid of the whole thing, you know? Like, have a potluck, where you're just buying stuff from Trader Joe's, so you don't have to cook. Like, there's always a way. The three main elements to play with are the environment, right? Because some people are like, oh, I like them, but I just hate where we always meet. Well, then suggest somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
It could be that you don't like being with those people. Like, you really like doing the thing, but that's the wrong group, right? Then find another group. And then sometimes it's the activity itself. I'm surprised so as adults, right, when we habituate behavior, we hate to admit that we just do it because that's always the way we've done it. It's a weird thing about the human experience. And so I'm surprised how many times, like, so how does your weekend go? Oh, well, yeah, I use this one example from someone I was working with. They were going to a Toastmasters class because when they initially went to it, and I like Toastmasters, so I always feel horrible because I'm not bagging on them. But this person had initially started going because they really liked the people in the group, but slowly but surely, the people that he liked had attrited out. And now he was just going because that's what he did. But he didn't like it. And I was like, you can stop going and just do something else you find enjoyable. And I found that over and over again. Like, look at the thing that you're doing. And if you're like, I don't, there's nothing in my life that's joyful, like generally, especially on the weekends, then there's an easy problem there to fix. There's some low hanging fruit where you can just stop doing something that you're doing or change it in a way that makes it more enjoyable. And it's a great kind of entryway into, oh, wait a second. Oh, yeah, I do have a little bit more control than I thought,
Well, that's like all we have control over, right? We have all these choices all day, every day that we get to make. And so often people have given their power away. And you have the power to shape your life. Like, yes, there's always going to be external circumstances that you don't have any control over, but the way that you respond and the choices that you make on how to navigate those things, and you can always pivot. You can always switch directions. You can always find a different way. I love the exercise one because I hate exercise. I hate it. I've always been athletic and I grew up playing sports and I did the workouts because you had to, because you were on a team and because you had to go to practice and all those things. And I always felt amazing afterwards, but self motivated working out has never been a strength of mine. And so I have had to accept that, like, there are days where I want to throw my yoga mat out on the back porch and just like do some stretching. There are days where I want to go take a 3-mile walk or go on a hike or, and that it's going to be different. It's not going to look like this strict regimented thing that I go to the gym for and I lift on Mondays and I run on Tuesdays and and that's what's supposed to look like came from social media. Right. And so I've had to like release all of that and remember to just listen to me and my body, what my body wants, and stay healthy in the way that is enjoyable and fun so that I will do it. Because if you make everything miserable to do, like, yeah, it's still hard. I'm 7 months pregnant right now. Walking 3 miles is really hard. Okay.
But life wasn't meant to not be hard, right? Like that's another, I always make sure that people, some people that, are only half listening will be like, what is he prescribing a life full of whimsy? Like, that's not it.
No.
Actually, like one of the coolest pieces of science I found putting the book together is called the Hedonic flexibility principle. And what it suggests is that when your fun cup is full, those are the people that want challenges because they feel fulfilled, right? So they seek out the hard stuff. They're the ones that are actually crushing it. When you're depleted, the last thing you want to do is go find something hard to do, right? Because you have no energy. So again, it's this paradox of like, chicken or the egg, right? But what we do know is, even folks that are crushing it, if they have transition rituals, that they take some time off the table for themselves, then they still have the vigor and vitality the next day to do the hard stuff. But the people that keep just grinding it out and aren't enjoying the things they do, ultimately, they're not going to be able to do it anymore because life is a long game for most of us.
Yeah. Balancing. It all comes back to balance. Life is hard. We all know life is hard. You're going to have to do hard things. But you also balance it with rest and pleasure, fun. And that's what gives you the juice to do the hard things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I love this. I looked up The Fun Habit. It's on Amazon, right? Everybody can go look that up, The Fun Habit, and tell everybody where they can find you, Mike.
Thank you for that. I write about the science of fun in a bunch of places like Psychology Today and whatnot, but michaelrucker.com, my website, has links to all my lay media posts and social media things and all of that. So yeah, the book got re-released as a paperback recently. So if you want to buy it on the cheap, it's now available in that format. And and you can find, if you're interested in my work, michaelrucker.com is the best place.
Awesome. And we'll put all those links in the show notes as well, so people can just scroll down and click and find you easily.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, it was so much fun getting to know you and more about your philosophies and your life's work today. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Jenny.
Yeah. All right. Happy parenting and good luck out there, everybody. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend. Learning is always more fun when you learn in community. Society has become so independent from one another, and parenting can be a lonely journey, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's why I'm here. If you've been seeking a more intentional approach to parenting, but you aren't sure where to start, I would love to hear from you. You can find me at www.jennyb.co. The link is in the show notes. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss out. And always remember, here, you are never alone. See you next week.